The first time I heard of Point Pleasant, it was through a faded clipping tucked in a forgotten corner of the archive room. The article, dated decades ago, bore a grainy photo of a bridge and a headline about tragedy. Something about that brittle piece of newsprint had drawn me in, though I couldn't say why. Perhaps it was desperation. My career had been on a downward spiral since my last story had unraveled under scrutiny. This, I thought, could be my way back. By the time I arrived in Point Pleasant, the sun hung low, casting the modest town in golden light. The streets were quiet, lined with weathered buildings whose windows seemed to watch my every move. It was a place caught between time, neither fully awake nor completely asleep. My inquiries about the recent sightings of a winged figure with piercing red eyes were met with wary looks and reluctant responses. At the local diner, an older man named Tom, his fingers gnarled with age and labor, leaned in close after some coaxing. "Some call it a curse," he said, voice low and deliberate. "It shows up when bad things are about to happen." He didn't elaborate, leaving me with a bitter coffee and a growing unease. My initial skepticism wavered as I delved into the town's history. Reports of a winged creature weren't new. The pattern was undeniable. Every sighting seemed to precede some calamity. I pored over police records, interviewed locals, and spent restless nights piecing together fragments of fear and folklore. It wasn't until I spoke with Lily, a schoolteacher with haunted eyes, that I began to feel the weight of what I'd uncovered. She described her encounter with the creature in vivid detail. The sound of massive wings slicing the air, the glowing eyes that seemed to pierce into her very soul. "It didn't hurt me," she said, "but it felt like it was warning me." That night, alone in my motel room, I replayed her words in my mind. The more I thought about it, the more my dreams twisted, until they became vivid fragments of shadow and crimson light. I woke drenched in sweat, the faint echo of something distant still lingering. The next morning, I made my way to the bridge, the structure towering like a sentinel over the river. I'd been told it was the site of the most frequent sightings, and now, standing beneath its steel arches, I understood why. The air was still, the world eerily quiet. It was then that I saw it, just a fleeting moment. A shape perched high on the bridge, too large to be a bird, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light of the setting sun. My breath caught, and a surge of primal fear coursed through me. And then it was gone. I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it, but the seed had been planted. Something ancient and unrelenting had taken root in Point Pleasant, and I had stepped into its orbit. The vision from the bridge clung to me, a shadow that refused to fade. I spent the next morning combing through Point Pleasant, speaking with anyone willing to entertain my questions. Most were hesitant, their answers short and guarded, as if discussing the creature might summon it. But one name kept surfacing: Margaret Cook, a recluse, living just outside town near an abandoned quarry. "She's seen it," Tom had muttered the night before. "Up close." His voice carried a note of something I couldn't quite place. Pity, perhaps. I found her house by following a dirt road that seemed forgotten by time. The structure loomed ahead, its roof sagging under the weight of years, surrounded by an overgrowth of thorny bushes. A single light glowed faintly in a window, a beacon in the desolation. She didn't answer my first knock, or the second, but on the third, the door creaked open just far enough for me to catch a glimpse of her face. "You're not from here," she said, her tone as sharp as broken glass. I introduced myself, explained my purpose, and for a moment, I thought she might slam the door. Instead, she stepped back, wordlessly inviting me into the dim, cluttered interior. Margaret didn't speak at first. She moved with a nervous energy, her hands trembling as she poured 2 mugs of tea. The walls were lined with faded photographs, most of them showing the same bridge, standing proud against a cloudless sky. "It's not what you think," she said finally, her voice barely above a murmur. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for a small leather-bound journal and flipped to a page filled with sketches. Wings, eyes, shapes that were both human and not. "It doesn't come to harm," she said, her gaze fixed on the book. "It comes to watch. And when it watches, something follows. Something worse." Her words were like a match to dry kindling, igniting the unease that had been smoldering since I arrived in Point Pleasant. I wanted to ask more, but before I could, Margaret's head snapped up, her eyes wide with alarm. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I strained my ears, but all I caught was the faint rustle of leaves outside. Still, her fear was infectious. She moved to the window, parting the curtain just enough to peek outside. "They're drawn to it," she said, her voice trembling now. "People like you, always looking for answers, always ending up." Her words cut off abruptly, and the mug in her hand shattered on the floor. I followed her gaze and saw nothing but the darkened woods beyond the house. But then came the sound, low, rhythmic, and unmistakable. A deep, almost mechanical thrum, like wings beating against the stillness of the air. I bolted for the door, my heart pounding. Margaret grabbed my arm. "You can't leave now," she hissed. "Once you've seen it, it doesn't let go." Ignoring her, I stumbled out into the night. The woods loomed before me, thick and oppressive. And then I saw it again. Perched atop the trees, its silhouette stark against the moonlight. The glowing red eyes met mine, and in that instant, it felt as though time itself had paused. A sudden gust of wind tore through the clearing, and I turned back toward the house. Margaret was gone, the door swinging open like an unspoken warning. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the corner of my motel room, every creak and groan of the old building amplified in the silence. Outside, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The morning brought no relief. The sunlight, filtered through the motel's threadbare curtains, felt hollow, as though it had forgotten how to warm. I left the room with a notebook in hand and a head full of questions that I wasn't sure anyone could or would answer. Margaret's warnings played on a loop in my mind, her fear infecting my resolve like a slow poison. I walked to the diner, the only place in town where I could hope for conversation without too many sideways glances. The usual patrons were there. Tom at the counter, his hands folded like a man in silent prayer, and a few scattered locals. I took a seat near the window, watching as a freight train passed slowly in the distance, its wheels grinding against the tracks. I had barely ordered coffee when Tom approached, his expression darker than the brew he poured. "Margaret spoke to you," he said, not as a question but as a statement. "Yes," I admitted, though I didn't mention the strange sound outside her house or her sudden disappearance. Tom leaned in close, his voice barely more than a growl. "She shouldn't have. Talking about it makes it stronger." Before I could press him further, the bell above the door jingled, and a woman walked in. She was younger than most of the crowd, with a face that carried the weight of too many sleepless nights. She scanned the room and zeroed in on me. "You're the journalist," she said, sitting down uninvited. Her tone was sharp, her eyes fierce. "I am," I replied, though my confidence was beginning to fray. "My brother is missing," she said bluntly. and he saw it before he vanished. Her words hit like a physical blow. I asked her name, Emily, and learned that her brother, David, had been one of the few who dared to hike near the old quarry after sundown. They found his truck near the woods, she said, her voice cracking, but no sign of him. Just this. She slid a photograph across the table. It showed the ground near the vehicle, a pattern of deep impressions in the dirt. They were too large to be footprints, but too irregular to be tire tracks. "What do you think it is?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. Emily hesitated, then said quietly, "It's not human." I left the diner with Emily's words weighing heavily on me. The photograph stayed folded in my pocket, its edges biting into my hand like a reminder of my own growing helplessness. That evening, I found myself drawn back to the bridge. The locals avoided it after dark, and I could feel why. The air seemed thicker here, as though the structure itself exhaled a silent warning. I stood at the edge, staring down at the black water below, when the rhythmic thrum returned. It wasn't loud, but it carried a strange resonance that seemed to vibrate through my chest. Then I saw it again. This time it wasn't perched or watching from a distance. It moved quick, deliberate, a shadow with substance. The wings unfolded, stretching impossibly wide, and those red eyes burned against the darkness. I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing. My flashlight fell from my hand, its beam bouncing wildly until it settled on something at the water's edge. A shoe. The mud surrounding it was disturbed, as though someone, or something, had been dragged away. The sound of wings grew louder, closer. I didn't dare look back as I scrambled toward my car, the engine sputtering to life just as a shadow passed overhead, blocking the stars for a fleeting moment. I drove until the bridge disappeared in the rearview mirror, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. But even as I reached the relative safety of town, the image of that shoe, muddy, abandoned, remained etched in my mind. Something was pulling at the threads of Point Pleasant, unraveling it piece by piece. And whatever it was, I was caught in its web. I didn't sleep that night. The motel room felt like a cell, its thin walls pressing in as the memory of the shadowed wings replayed in my mind. I paced the narrow space until dawn, going over every detail of what I'd seen and heard. The shoe, the disturbed earth, the sound of wings. It all felt like a puzzle with pieces carved from nightmares. By morning, I had a plan. If I was going to find answers, I needed to go where no one else dared. The quarry. The place was mentioned in almost every story I'd heard, from Margaret's whispered fears to Emily's missing brother. If the truth lurked anywhere, it was there. The locals were no help. Each time I mentioned the quarry, faces turned away, hands waved me off, and voices dropped into muttered excuses. Only Tom, grim as ever, offered a word of advice. "Take salt," he said, "and leave before sunset." Salt? It seemed absurd, but the weight of his tone silenced any argument. I found a grocery store and bought a small bag of it, slipping it into my backpack along with a flashlight, a notebook, and a thermos of lukewarm coffee. The road to the quarry was overgrown, the trees closing in like a tunnel. The closer I got, the quieter the world became. Even the birds seemed to avoid this stretch of wilderness. By the time I reached the clearing, the air felt heavy, not with heat but with something harder to define. The quarry loomed ahead, its jagged edges carved into the earth like an open wound. The water at its base was unnaturally still, reflecting the gray sky above. I started down the path, each step crunching against loose gravel. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional skitter of stones dislodged by my boots. My flashlight swept over the walls of the quarry, revealing jagged rock faces and deep shadows that seemed to move just out of sight. It wasn't long before I found the first sign of trouble. Near a cluster of boulders, there was a scattering of items. A water bottle, a torn jacket, and a notebook with pages warped by rain. I knelt, my heart pounding, and flipped through the damp pages. The handwriting was shaky, the words barely legible. It watches from the edge. It knows when you're alone. Don't look into its eyes. A sound broke the stillness. Something faint but distinct. A rustling like fabric brushing against stone. I spun around, my flashlight darting over the landscape. There was nothing there, or so I thought. As I turned back, the beam caught a figure perched on the edge of the quarry, silhouetted against the dim light. It wasn't human, too tall, too thin, its limbs elongated in ways that defied anatomy. Its wings were folded tight against its back, and those eyes, those terrible red eyes, glowed like embers. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, but the air around it seemed to ripple, as if reality itself struggled to contain it. I don't know how long I stood there, locked in its gaze. Seconds, minutes, time felt meaningless. Then, without warning, it moved. The wings unfurled with a sound like tearing fabric, and the figure rose into the air, vanishing into the gray sky with a rush of wind that sent loose stones tumbling into the water below. I stumbled back, my foot catching on a rock. I fell hard, the flashlight skittering away. When I scrambled to retrieve it, I saw something carved into the rock where the figure had stood. It was a single word, etched deep and jagged. Warning. My hands trembled as I traced the letters, the rough edges biting into my fingertips. This was no prank, no urban legend spun out of boredom. Something ancient and incomprehensible was tethered to this place, and it had noticed me. I didn't wait to find out what it wanted. I fled the quarry, the sound of my footsteps swallowed by the endless quiet. But even as I reached the car, slamming the door and peeling away down the dirt road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped. Whatever it wasn't confined to the quarry. It was following me. The drive back into town was a blur of panic. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Every bump in the road felt amplified, every shadow among the trees like a dark figure watching from the edge of my vision. The silence of the woods pressed in, louder than any sound, and I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those red eyes glowing behind me. When I reached the motel, I didn't bother locking the car or even grabbing my bag. I burst into my room, slamming the door shut and bracing it with a chair. My breathing came in shallow gasps as I paced the small space, trying to make sense of what had happened. The word warning burned in my memory. It wasn't just a message, it was a promise. But of what and why me? I sat on the bed, running a hand through my hair. The notebook I'd taken from the quarry lay on the nightstand, its warped pages still damp. I flipped through it again, forcing myself to read the fragments of text despite the unease they stirred. The dreams come first. It waits in the dark. The bridge is the key. The bridge. Of course. It was the one constant in every story I'd heard. The thread tying everything together. Whatever this thing was, it seemed drawn to the bridge like a moth to a flame. I stood, determination overtaking fear. If the bridge held answers, I needed to go there. But as I turned toward the door, the lights flickered. Once, twice, then out. Darkness swallowed the room, thick and impenetrable. The hum of the fluorescent bulbs was replaced by an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. I fumbled for my flashlight, my fingers shaking as I clicked it on. The beam swept across the room, illuminating the peeling wallpaper and the battered furniture. First, nothing seemed amiss, but then I saw it on the far wall just above the mirror. A shadow. Shouldn't have been there. There was nothing to cast it, no object or figure, but it moved, shifting subtly, as if it were alive. I stepped back, my breath caught in my chest. The shadow stretched and twisted, creeping down the wall like spilled ink. It reached the edge of the mirror and stopped, pooling into a shape that was almost but not quite human. And then the eyes appeared, 2 pinpricks of crimson light, staring back at me from within the dark mass. They weren't just eyes. They were alive, burning with a malevolence that sent a jolt of primal terror through me. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, the beam spinning wildly, casting distorted shapes onto the walls. In the chaos of flickering light and shadow, the figure began to move, slow and deliberate. "Stay away," I choked out, my voice barely more than a rasp. The figure paused, its head tilting in an almost curious motion. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The lights flickered back on, the room returning to its dull, unremarkable state. But I knew better. The shadow might have vanished, but its presence lingered. It was in the air, in the silence, in the cold knot of fear tightening in my stomach. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the corner of the room, flashlight in hand, my eyes fixed on the mirror. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, sent my heart racing. When dawn finally broke, I left the motel without looking back. My next destination was clear, the bridge. Whatever awaited me there, I had to face it. Because now I wasn't just chasing a story. The story was chasing me. The bridge loomed in the distance like an iron specter, its silhouette etched against the dim morning light. The closer I got, the more the air seemed to thicken, as if the structure itself carried the weight of something unspeakable. Parking a short distance away, I stepped out and looked up at the towering arches. The metal was rusted in places, streaked with years of weathering, but there was something else. Patterns in the discoloration that almost looked deliberate. Shapes, symbols. My mind rebelled against understanding them, as if they were meant to remain unnoticed. The town was quiet, unnervingly so. Only the faint sound of water lapping against the supports below broke the stillness. I walked along the pedestrian path, my footsteps echoing hollowly on the cracked concrete. Midway across, I stopped. It was there, directly beneath the central arch, that I noticed the first real sign. A scattering of feathers, jet black and slick as if freshly plucked. They formed a rough semicircle on the ground, their arrangement unnatural and precise. I crouched to examine them, a chill crawling up my spine. Coincidence? I murmured aloud, my voice thin and unconvincing. But even as I said it, I knew better. I stood and turned my gaze downward, peering over the rail. The river moved sluggishly beneath me, its surface murky and uninviting. Something about it felt wrong, an unnatural stillness, as though it were waiting. Then I heard it, a low hum, almost imperceptible at first, rising from the supports below. It was rhythmic, pulsing like a heartbeat, and with each pulse, the bridge seemed to vibrate subtly. I leaned further over the railing, straining to see the source, when a sudden flash of movement caught my eye. A figure darted along the bank below, impossibly fast. My stomach lurched as I tried to follow it, but it was gone before I could make sense of it. The hum grew louder, more insistent, and with it came a sensation that I was not alone. I spun around, scanning the bridge. Empty. Yet the feeling of being watched was undeniable. I could feel eyes, no, something deeper than that, something unseen but wholly present, fixed on me. My pulse quickened as I stepped backward, my body instinctively retreating. Then the hum stopped. Silence fell like a hammer, oppressive and absolute. I stood frozen, my breath catching in my throat, when a sound broke through. A metallic screech, deafening and raw, as if the bridge itself were groaning under an unbearable weight. The arches above me trembled. Rust flakes fell like dry leaves, and I staggered backward, watching in horror as a shadow began to take form on the walkway ahead. It was enormous, its wings unfurling slowly, each movement deliberate and dreadful. The figure stood impossibly tall, its silhouette stark against the morning light. And then, those eyes, brilliant, burning, and unyielding, locked onto mine. My knees buckled, but I didn't fall. Something in the creature's gaze held me upright, a force that transcended fear and veered into something primal, something ancient. The figure didn't move closer. Instead, it raised one elongated arm, pointing toward the far end of the bridge. Its gesture was slow, deliberate, and filled with an authority that was neither human nor merciful. I wanted to run, to flee from its presence, but my feet remained rooted. Every instinct screamed at me to look away, but I couldn't. The figure's gaze bore into me, a silent command that I couldn't defy. Then it spoke. Not in words, but in a sensation. A thought pressed into my mind with the weight of 1,000 voices. Go. The command was final. The next moment, the figure dissolved into the air, leaving only a faint ripple in its wake. The bridge groaned once more, its vibrations subsiding into a grim silence. I didn't wait to understand. I ran, my footsteps hammering against the concrete, the river below a blur as I fled toward the far end. The cold wind stung my face, carrying with it a sense of urgency that I couldn't shake. By the time I reached the other side, my chest heaved with exertion. I looked back, half expecting to see the figure still standing there, but the bridge was empty. And yet, the feeling of its presence lingered, as if it had etched itself into the very structure. Point Pleasant was no longer a quiet town. It was alive with something unspoken, something I had only begun to uncover. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't finished with me. Returning to town felt like stepping into another reality, one where time had unraveled and rewoven itself into a jagged, unrecognizable shape. The streets of Point Pleasant were eerily desolate. Houses that once exuded small-town charm seemed hollow, their windows darkened like vacant eyes. Every step I took felt as though the earth beneath me was shifting, conspiring against my progress. My first instinct was to retreat to my rented room, but the thought of solitude was unbearable. Instead, I sought refuge in the diner where I'd met Mrs. Harper. The bell above the door jangled weakly as I entered, the sound swallowed by the heavy quiet inside. The diner was nearly empty, save for 2 elderly men huddled at a corner table, their conversation low and urgent. I recognized one of them, Bill, the man who'd mentioned the old bridge, but his demeanor now was stripped of bravado. He looked haunted, his shoulders hunched as though carrying an invisible weight. I approached the counter, where a weary waitress stood wiping down the surface with slow, mechanical movements. She didn't acknowledge me until I cleared my throat. "Coffee?" I asked, my voice raspier than I'd intended. She nodded, pouring the steaming liquid without a word. Her hand trembled slightly as she set the cup down. "You were at the bridge," she said finally, her tone flat but laced with something close to pity. I didn't ask how she knew. There was an unspoken understanding here, an awareness that permeated the air like smoke. "What do you know about it?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Her gaze flicked to the men in the corner, then back to me. She leaned in, her voice barely audible. "People who see it, they don't come back the same." "See what?" I pressed, though I already knew the answer. Her eyes darted to the window, as though expecting the thing itself to appear on the other side of the glass. "The red eyes," she whispered. A sudden noise interrupted us. A harsh scraping sound, like metal dragged against stone. The men at the table froze, their heads snapping toward the window. My heart thudded as I turned to look. Outside, the streetlights flickered erratically, casting distorted shadows that writhed like living things. The sound came again, louder this time, accompanied by a faint vibration that rattled the coffee cup in my hand. One of the men stood abruptly, his chair toppling backward. "It's here," he muttered, his face pale as ash. Without another word, he bolted for the door, disappearing into the night. The waitress clutched the counter, her knuckles white. "You should leave," she said, her voice shaking. But I couldn't move. My journalistic instincts warred with my rising panic. Whatever was happening, it was escalating, and I was in the thick of it. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of movement, a fleeting shadow that seemed to glide rather than walk. It was heading toward the bridge. The remaining man at the table muttered something under his breath, his hands clasped in what looked like prayer. I turned to the waitress, my decision made. "Where does that road lead?" I asked, pointing to the direction of the shadow. She hesitated, her expression a mix of fear and disbelief. "You don't want to follow it," she said. But I did. Before she could protest further, I left the diner, stepping into the cold night. The wind had picked up, carrying with it a faint, metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. The streetlights continued to flicker, their erratic pulses guiding me toward the bridge like a macabre beacon. The road stretched ahead, empty and foreboding. As I walked, the noise grew louder, the same rhythmic hum I'd heard earlier, now accompanied by a faint, almost melodic undertone. It was both hypnotic and deeply unsettling, pulling me forward despite every instinct screaming for me to turn back. When I reached the bridge, I stopped at the edge, my breath hitching in my chest. The structure seemed alive, its metal beams vibrating faintly in the dim light. And there, beneath the central arch, stood the figure. It didn't move this time. It simply stood, its wings folded tightly against its body, the glowing red eyes fixed on me with an intensity that burned. I should have run. Instead, I stepped closer, my footsteps echoing on the concrete. The hum grew louder, the vibrations stronger, until the air itself seemed to pulse with the creature's presence. Then it spoke, not in words but in images. A flood of visions overwhelmed me. Collapsing structures, screaming faces, rushing water, destruction on a scale I couldn't comprehend. And then, just as suddenly, the vision stopped. The creature unfurled its wings, the movement slow and deliberate, and for the first time, I noticed the scars, deep, jagged lines that marred the dark surface like wounds long healed. It raised its arm again, pointing not at me, but at the bridge itself. And in that moment, I understood. Something was coming, something far worse than I had imagined. And the Mothman wasn't the cause. It was the warning. I don't remember turning back toward town. My legs moved on their own, my mind consumed by the image of the creature. Its silent gesture and urgent plea I couldn't ignore. The air grew thicker with each step, a suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe. The bridge's vibration still echoed in my bones, a phantom rhythm that wouldn't relent. The streets were deserted as I reached the diner again. The lights inside flickered dimly, casting distorted shadows that stretched unnaturally long. The waitress was gone, her station abandoned. Even the elderly man who had clung to his prayers had vanished. A chill passed through me, but not from the cold. It was the kind of unease that spoke to a deeper instinct, an awareness that something fundamental had shifted. Then I heard it, the faint hum. It wasn't coming from the bridge this time. It was closer, resonating from somewhere just out of sight. I followed the sound, my feet crunching on the gravel of an alleyway behind the diner. The hum swelled as I turned a corner, revealing an old utility shed with its door ajar. Light spilled from within, faint and flickering like a dying flame. I hesitated, my heart pounding. Every fiber of my being screamed to leave, to retreat to the safety of my room and lock the door. But I couldn't turn away, not now. I stepped inside. The shed was cramped, its walls lined with rusted tools and ancient machinery that seemed untouched for decades. At the center of the room stood an old radio, its dials glowing faintly. The hum emanated from it, a low, pulsing tone that seemed alive. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I adjusted the dial. The hum shifted, rising and falling like a heartbeat. Then, amidst the static, a voice broke through. "Coming soon, bridge." The words were fragmented, distorted, but unmistakable. My breath hitched as I leaned closer, straining to hear more. "Leave, before it's too late." The voice cut off abruptly, replaced by a deafening burst of static that sent me stumbling back. The radio sparked violently, the light in its dials flaring once before going dark. I stood there, frozen, the silence in the shed pressing down on me like a physical weight. What had I just heard? And who or what had spoken those words? The hum was gone, but the sense of urgency it had carried lingered. My mind raced as I stumbled out of the shed, back into the cold night. The streetlights flickered overhead, their light dimmer now, casting the town in an eerie half-darkness. In the distance, the bridge loomed, its silhouette stark against the night sky. I made my way back to my room, my thoughts a whirlwind of half-formed connections and unanswered questions. The creature, the warnings, the visions, it all pointed to something catastrophic, something that couldn't be ignored. But what could I do? I was just a journalist, a man chasing a story that had become far more than I'd bargained for. As I reached the door to my room, I paused. The feeling was back, that oppressive weight, the sense of being watched. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the empty street. First, I saw nothing. Then, in the shadow of a nearby building, a pair of red eyes blinked into existence. They didn't move. They didn't blink again. They just stared, unflinching and unyielding, as though daring me to act. I stepped inside and locked the door, my hands shaking. Whatever was happening in Point Pleasant was building towards something, and I was running out of time to figure out what. That night, sleep didn't come easily. My mind replayed the events over and over, each fragment a puzzle piece that refused to fit. And through it all, the hum lingered, a phantom sound that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. When the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, I rose, my resolve hardened. If the creature's warning was to be understood, I would have to go back, to the bridge, to the heart of whatever nightmare was unfolding in this town. I didn't know what I would find, but I knew one thing with certainty. Point Pleasant's secrets wouldn't stay buried much longer. Morning did little to dispel the unease that had settled over me like a second skin. The pale sunlight seemed weak, struggling against the overcast sky. It cast the town in a sickly glow, revealing the decay I had somehow missed before. Cracks in the sidewalks, peeling paint on the storefronts, windows boarded up hastily as though their occupants had fled. The diner was closed when I passed by. The open sign flipped backward. Through the glass, the interior looked untouched, yet lifeless. The hum from the shed haunted my thoughts, and my hands twitched as though the vibration had seeped into my veins. I made my way to the bridge. The air grew heavier with each step. The structure loomed ahead, its arching form more ominous in the daylight. A strange quiet surrounded it. No birds, no distant hum of cars. Just the dull creak of the metal as a soft breeze stirred the cables. I stood at its entrance, the black asphalt stretching ahead like an invitation to the unknown. As I hesitated, a figure approached. A woman, bundled in a thick coat, her face partially obscured by a scarf. She moved with a hurried purpose, her eyes darting to the bridge, then back to me. "Are you here for it?" she asked abruptly, her voice strained. "For what?" I replied, my throat dry. She glanced back at the bridge. "You shouldn't be here. It's not safe." "What's not safe?" I pressed, taking a step closer. Her expression darkened. "It's watching, always watching. The bridge isn't what it seems anymore." Before I could ask more, she turned and hurried off, disappearing down a side street. Her warning, cryptic and vague, hung in the air like the static from the radio. I stepped onto the bridge. The sound was faint at first, a low groan that seemed to emanate from deep within the structure. I paused, listening intently. The groan grew louder, a vibration that I could feel beneath my feet. Halfway across, I stopped. Something wasn't right. The air felt charged, as if the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. The vibration intensified, a rhythmic pulse that matched the hum I had heard the night before. And then I saw it, the creature. It stood at the far end of the bridge, its wings folded against its body, its red eyes fixed on me with an unrelenting gaze. Even from a distance, I could feel its presence, an oppressive force that pressed against my chest. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The creature raised a clawed hand, pointing toward the town. It didn't advance, didn't make a sound. It simply stood there, its gesture filled with an urgency I couldn't ignore. The bridge groaned again, louder this time, the sound echoing through the stillness. The vibration beneath my feet turned into a shudder, and I stumbled, catching myself on the railing. A sudden flash of movement to my left caught my attention. A car was speeding toward the bridge, its tires squealing against the asphalt. I waved my arms, shouting a warning, but the driver didn't slow. The creature turned its head toward the car, its red eyes flaring brightly. The car veered sharply, skidding to a stop just feet away from me. The driver, a man in his 40s, threw open the door and stumbled out, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "Did you see it?" he gasped, his eyes wide with fear. "See what?" I demanded, though I already knew the answer. The thing with wings," he stammered, clutching the car door for support. "It's been following me since the quarry. I thought I could outrun it." His words trailed off as the bridge groaned again, a sharp crack splitting the air. We both turned toward the creature, but it was gone. The air where it had stood shimmered faintly, as if marked by its presence. The man didn't wait for an explanation. He jumped back into his car and sped off, leaving me alone on the trembling bridge. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. The warnings, the hum, the groans of the bridge. All of it was connected, but the pieces refused to align. Then I felt it, a sudden shift beneath my feet. The bridge shuddered violently, the sound of metal straining and twisting filling the air. I ran. The vibration grew stronger with each step, the groaning metal deafening. I reached the edge just as a deafening crack split the air. Turning back, I saw it. The bridge's cables snapping one by one, the structure twisting unnaturally as though alive. And amidst the chaos, a faint glow hovered where the creature had stood, its red eyes lingering like embers in the smoke. I didn't stop running until I was back in town, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The streets were still empty, the silence now suffocating. Somehow, I knew this was only the beginning. Back in town, the air had shifted. The streets seemed narrower, the buildings leaning slightly inward as if conspiring against the fragile normalcy I clung to. The bridge was no longer visible from where I stood, but its vibrations, its malevolence, lingered in my bones. I ducked into the library. It was the only place that felt neutral, its musty air and rows of books offering a fragile sanctuary. The librarian, a wiry man with thinning hair, glanced up briefly, his eyes darting to the window behind me. He said nothing, but his hand trembled as he adjusted his glasses. The archives were in the basement. I descended the creaking staircase, each step groaning under my weight as though the wood itself objected to my presence. The hum returned faintly, or maybe it never left. The basement was colder than expected, the smell of damp paper and mildew clinging to the walls. I flipped through old newspapers, scanning for mentions of the bridge or the creature. The articles painted a grim picture. A town plagued by unexplained events. Cattle found lifeless in fields, their eyes reflecting nothing but red. An entire school bus stalled mid-bridge one stormy night, the driver swearing the wheels wouldn't turn no matter how much he pressed the gas. And always, the figure in the shadows, wings folded, watching. One article caught my eye. Dated November 1967, it described the collapse of a different bridge, the Silver Bridge, claiming 46 lives. The author speculated about structural issues, but the accompanying photo made my blood freeze. In the background, perched on a ledge above the wreckage, was a faint outline of something with wings. The creature wasn't new. My pulse quickened as I flipped to the next page, but the rest of the article had been torn out. I searched frantically through the folders, scattering papers across the table. Looking for something specific, I spun around, nearly knocking over the stack of newspapers. The librarian stood at the foot of the stairs, his expression unreadable. Yes, I stammered, trying to steady my breathing. The Silver Bridge collapse. Do you have more on it? His lips tightened. That file's incomplete. Some say it's better that way. I took a step toward him. What do you mean? He hesitated, then gestured for me to follow him back upstairs. Behind the counter, he produced a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age. This belonged to a reporter who was here during the collapse, he said, placing it gently on the counter. He didn't finish his story. I opened the journal. The handwriting was rushed, frantic, as though the author had been in a race against time. Descriptions of the creature mirrored what I'd heard. Red eyes, massive wings, an overwhelming presence. But one line stood out, The bridge isn't a place. It's a tether, holding something back. And the creature isn't the danger. It's the warning. A crash interrupted my thoughts. The librarian and I both turned toward the door, where the glass pane now lay in shards across the floor. Outside, the wind howled unnaturally, papers and debris swirling in a chaotic dance. And there, in the distance, barely visible against the gray sky, was the creature. It hovered above the town, its wings motionless, its red eyes fixed on me. The librarian grabbed my arm. "You need to leave." "No," I said, pulling away. "It's here for a reason." He shook his head, his face pale. "You don't understand. It's already too late." Another crash, this one deeper, reverberating through the ground, came from the direction of the bridge. I bolted out the door, the librarian's protests fading behind me. The streets were deserted, the town abandoned, as though the people had sensed something I was only beginning to grasp. When I reached the bridge, the sight before me defied reason. The structure was alive, its metal frame twisting and bending as though struggling against invisible chains. The hum was deafening now, a relentless vibration that resonated in my skull. And amidst it all stood the creature, perched on the highest cable like a sentinel. Then it moved, its wings unfurled, stretching impossibly wide, casting a shadow over the bridge. It launched into the air, circling once before diving straight toward me. I braced myself, expecting impact, but the creature soared past, its wings skimming so close that I felt the rush of air. It landed on the road behind me, blocking my escape, and then it spoke. Not in words, but in a piercing sound that reverberated through my mind. Images flooded my vision. The bridge collapsing, the town swallowed by chaos, the creature watching it all unfold. A warning. I turned back to the bridge. Its vibrations had reached a fever pitch, the cables snapping one by one. I had seconds, maybe less. The creature rose into the air again, circling the bridge. It wasn't trying to stop the destruction. It was marking the end. I ran, my lungs burning as the ground quaked beneath me. Behind me, the final cable snapped with a sound like a thunderclap, and the bridge began to fall. The last thing I saw was the creature, hovering in the air, its eyes blazing as the structure crumbled into the water below. The town was gone. It happened so swiftly, the bridge crumbling under the weight of whatever forces had been at work. The ground had trembled, the air had thickened, and then there was only the silence. It was an unnatural quiet, the kind that settles after something terrible has passed. An eerie stillness that holds its breath, as if the world itself is waiting for something. I was far from the wreckage, but the town's destruction seemed to reach me, as though the ripple of that collapse was alive, an unseen force that lingered in the very air. The creature had vanished, but its presence remained. The tension from before, the ever-present threat, was gone, but something worse had replaced it. I stumbled back into the remains of what had once been Point Pleasant. The streets, once full of life, now lay abandoned. The buildings had not only been emptied of people, they felt drained, like hollow shells. Windows that had once gleamed now stood dark, doors left ajar, as though the inhabitants had vanished in a rush, too terrified to take anything with them. I didn't know where to go. I walked through the streets, the weight of my own footsteps making the silence feel deeper, more suffocating. The wind no longer howled with that unnatural sound. Instead, it whispered, but the whispers had no source. No trees swaying, no breeze moving the air. It was just the sound of something unseen, something just out of reach. I made my way to the old church. Its doors had been left slightly open, the hinges creaking as I pushed them wide. Inside, the faint smell of incense and old wood filled the air. But there was no comfort to be found here. A single candle flickered on the altar, its flame weak, as though it too feared the darkness that had come. I approached it, my fingers trembling as I touched the edge of the pew. Suddenly, there was a noise, a soft scraping, like the sound of nails against stone. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The noise grew louder, and I realized it was coming from behind the altar. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I turned slowly, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across the walls. There, emerging from the darkness, was something that hadn't been there moments before. It was a figure, hunched over, its back curved as if it had been waiting for centuries. The same red eyes gleamed from the darkness, not the creature from the bridge, but something else, something older, far more ancient. The thing stepped forward. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body swaying with each movement, its face hidden in shadow. The only part of it I could make out clearly were those eyes, red, glowing, relentless. Came closer. I should have run, but my legs wouldn't move. The air seemed to have thickened again, pressing down on me like a weight, making every breath harder to take. The thing didn't speak, but I could feel its thoughts in my mind, seeping into me, wrapping around my consciousness like tendrils. It wasn't here to hurt me. It wasn't here for any of us. It was waiting. I stumbled back, my pulse racing, but I couldn't look away from those eyes. There was something in them, something that made the very foundation of my being tremble. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was the reason for everything. The bridge, the creature, the town's collapse, it had all led to this moment. Why? I whispered, my voice cracking. Why didn't you stop it? The thing cocked its head slightly, and I felt the weight of its gaze shift in a way that made my stomach twist. It wasn't a question it could answer, not in words, not in any way that made sense. It took another step forward. I reached out, my hand brushing the edge of the pew, my mind racing for any answer, anything that could make this feel real, make it stop. But there was no stopping it. There was no stopping what had already been set in motion. The creature from the bridge, the one that had been watching over the town, had not been a savior. It had not been a warning. It had been a part of it, part of something far bigger than this place, far older than any of us. It was an omen not of death, but of something else, something far worse. Couldn't breathe, couldn't move. All I could do was watch as the thing loomed closer, its red eyes never wavering from mine. And then, as though sensing my thoughts, it stopped. It tilted its head once more, and the red glow of its eyes seemed to fade, just a little, as though it were considering something. And in that moment, I understood. It wasn't here for us. It wasn't here for the town or for me. It was here because we had always been a part of its story. We had always been its tether, its link to this world. And now the tether had broken. The town had vanished, swallowed up by forces far beyond any of us. The creature didn't move again. It didn't need to. Its job was done. And the only thing left now was the silence. The silence in the church had become unbearable, stretching out, pulling every ounce of breath from my lungs. It was as if time itself had paused, caught in a moment suspended between something I could no longer comprehend and something I was too terrified to understand. The creature, no, whatever it truly was, stood before me, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. Its eyes no longer burned with that familiar, relentless red glow, but something deeper, something darker lingered in the depths, something that seemed to reach inside my very soul. I had no more questions left. I didn't need answers anymore. There was only the feeling, the dreadful, suffocating feeling that I had been a part of this all along, that everything I had done, everything I had uncovered, had been nothing more than the unraveling of a story already written long before I'd stepped into it. A story that began when the town had first been founded. A story that began with the first death on the bridge. And I, Peter Grayson, had been an unwilling player in its finale. My mind reeled. I tried to move, but my legs felt as though they were bound to the ground, as though I was rooted in place. The creature, whatever it was, did not move. It did not need to. Its stillness was not one of peace, but of something far more terrible. It was a warning, a reminder, a memory. The church doors suddenly slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash, and the world around me flickered, shifting, distorting, as if I had stepped into another reality altogether. The walls bent, stretched, the light in the room twisted into a sickly green hue. I gasped, reaching out for something solid to hold on to, but there was nothing. The floor beneath me felt like it was being pulled away, as if the earth itself was dissolving, sinking into the void. And then, in the stillness that followed, a voice whispered, not in my ears, but in my mind, as if it had always been there, waiting. You've been here before. The words pierced my thoughts, sending a sharp, cold shiver through me. No, couldn't be here. Not like this. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, but the voice only grew clearer. You've always been here. I staggered back, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but the walls pressed in closer, and the air turned thick with the smell of decay. And then, through the distorted haze, I saw it, the bridge. The same bridge that had always been there, looming in my mind, a bridge that I had never fully understood. But now, standing before me, I did. It wasn't just a bridge. It was the barrier between worlds, and I had crossed it. I had crossed it the moment I first set foot in Point Pleasant. All the clues, all the strange occurrences, they were never meant to be solved. They were signs of something far worse than I could have ever imagined. The Mothman, the disappearances, the town's downfall. It had all been inevitable. A cycle that had begun long before my arrival. A cycle that was never meant to end. The thing before me, the creature, was no more than a manifestation, an echo of what was to come. It wasn't an omen. It wasn't a warning. It was simply the keeper of the bridge. The one who ensured that the stories, the mysteries, the tragedies would always return. No matter how many times they were buried. No matter how many people tried to escape. The truth was more horrifying than anything I had ever feared. Point Pleasant had never been a town of innocence. It had been a gateway, a place where the living and the dead, the past and the future could intertwine. And I, in my search for answers, had only opened it wider. The Mothman, it was me. I blinked, and the world around me shattered. The church, the town, the bridge. Everything dissolved into darkness. The creature was gone, its presence lingering only in the deep recesses of my mind. I opened my eyes again, and the landscape had changed. The old church was gone, the bridge was gone, and in their place was something far more disturbing. I was back in the city I had never left. Point Pleasant was no longer a town of old buildings and lost souls. It was an empty space, a void that stretched on forever, its edges curling inward, drawing me closer to its center. and standing before me was the bridge again. The one I had thought had fallen apart. The one that had destroyed everything. The same bridge, the same path, the same fate. And as I walked toward it, drawn like a moth to the flame, I realized what had truly happened. There would be no escape. There was no end to this. I was trapped in the cycle, doomed to repeat it forever. And then, in a whisper that echoed in my mind, I heard it once more. You've been here before, and this time I understood. The bridge was not a way out. It was a way in. A way in for all of us. The town of Point Pleasant had never been real. It was a dream, my dream, and I was never meant to wake up.